Well, hello everyone. Get my green screen adjusted here. Bear with me for a minute. Get everything settled here. How's it going, everybody? You guys hear me okay? Good evening, Kelly. Can you hear me okay? Is my mic working this time? Yay! Awesome. Alrighty. Adjust a little here. New webcam works really well. All right. Well, it's been a while since I did one of these. Hey, Indulge. So I just figured we'd hang out a little bit for a while, maybe read some Halloween stories from my book, Fall Frights. Um, how's you guys' Sunday going? Doing all right? I got to go back to work tomorrow, so not quite looking forward to that, but play it by ear, I guess. Oh, I don't know how long we're going to stream tonight. I just figured I'd come in and read a couple stories. You guys always seem to enjoy a live stream, so oh, thinking about thinking about adding more videos to the lineup every week. I don't know how you guys feel about that. I'm sure you guys are probably fine with it. Um, YouTube's been doing weird stuff with my monetization lately, so I figure maybe I'll put up some longer videos during the week and, with my other stuff. So you guys can maybe look forward to that a little bit. Let's see. Oh, we've got four in. Nice. I figure I'll give it a few minutes, let everybody figure out that I had to change over. Um I had it set up on a different one, and oh, of course. I had it set up on a different one, but I had set it up on my phone, so it wanted to know why I wasn't going mobile. That's why I had to set up the new stream. I think I had a couple of people waiting, so I'll give them a couple of minutes to swap over. Lucky, I'm waiting on that. I can't wait to be retired. Ugh. Oh, excuse me. It's been a long day. Had to go open the had to go open the kitchen this morning. So I've been up since about 3 o'clock this morning. Let's see. I think most of you guys have heard stuff out of my book. Is there anything particularly Halloweeny you guys want to hear? Like, I can look up some of the stuff I've already read this month if you guys would prefer one of those. Let's see. That is true. I do a little bit of freelance stuff on the side, and I sell comics and collectibles and things. And I find running my own business, I seem to work a little harder than I do at work, even. It's definitely nicer when you're working for yourself, though. That's for sure. Well, I reckon we'll go ahead and get started. I don't think any of you guys are going to mind if we go ahead and start rolling on the stories. Hang on, let me. There we go. Alrighty. Start with a classic, Blood Pumpkins. Some of you guys remember that one. Let's see. I might turn on a little bit of light if I can find my light. Cats have been playing with my ring light again. I hope so. It would be nice. That's why I've been thinking about adding on the longer form videos during the week. I was up over $100 a month in monetization, and then 2 days ago they're like, "No, you're down around 80 now." I'm like, that doesn't seem right. I don't know. The YouTube algorithm and monetization on that respect is kind of a mystery to me. Just sort of does whatever it feels like, it seems. Alrighty, let's see. We're gonna start with Blood Pumpkins, and I'll probably stop every now and again and answer chats. So y'all feel free to shoot me questions or story suggestions, and away we go. What in the hell is that? Clarence had gone to Reggie's Veggies to buy seeds, just as he had every year since Reggie had opened. David Decker probably bought his seeds here too, Clarence reflected. It was part of the reason Clarence kept coming back. The fact that Reggie was a friend since boyhood and Clarence taking his business to the new feed store up the road would hurt him was secondary. Clarence wanted to beat David, wanted to beat him so bad that he could taste it. David was a bit of a local celebrity, a legend in the agricultural community, and he'd grown the biggest pumpkins in the county for the last 5 years running. Clarence had been content with second place. Oh, thank you, my dear. My wife brought me some tea. Oh. Let's see, where were we? For the last 5 years, Clarence had been content with second place, but he felt that this year was going to be different. This was the year that he beat David Decker and took his rightful place as the biggest pumpkin grower in the county. This was also year was also different because Reggie said that he had something special for Clarence. What he had was a secret weapon, and he assured him that it would finally wipe the smile off of Decker's face for good. Reggie had no reason to dislike Decker. He was probably one of Reggie's best customers, all told. But the old man had been getting cocky lately, and his bravado had turned the humble produce peddler's stomach. Clarence picked up the packet and looked at it. It was just a normal pack of seeds, maybe a little old and crumpled, but clearly just seeds. Reggie had found them in a trunk that had belonged to his grandfather, and they looked eldritch in the semi-modern countertop. Excuse me. The paper had taken on the soft, velvety feel of a material that's seen the fall of the Second World War, and the seeds inside felt like little bullets under Clarence's thumb. The paper declared them to be. I'm not even going to try that. I had to get a German translation for that one. Oh, here we go. Blutkrebis, and everything on the package was in a foreign language. He would have sworn it was something Reggie had bought at the joke shop, if he hadn't been so serious. To be sure, Reggie was a practical joker, but his face was stone serious as he looked from yeah, as he looked from Reggie across the counter of the vegetable stand. Blood pumpkins, Clarence said skeptically. Blood pumpkins, Reggie intoned back with deep seriousness. I don't know, Reggie. These things look older than God. You think they'll grow? Absolutely, Reggie said, stretching the one word into three. Granddad brought them back from Germany, and he said the pumpkins he saw over there were huge. Clarence scoffed. Your granddad was a sodbuster, just like mine. When did he go to Germany? During the war, same as your granddad, except your granddad spent it in Alaska. Clarence wanted to take offense to that, but Reggie was right. Granddad had gotten a very cushy post, while Reggie's granddad had gotten half his leg blown off by a potato masher and was sent home with honors. Reggie's granddad had used his payout from the government to buy the building where the feed store now sat, while Clarence's granddad had used the money to buy the land where the farm now sat. Just because Reggie Sr. had been a drunk who had squandered the family business was no fault of his. Let me get my usual spread of regular pumpkins too, Reggie, just to be safe. So, how do they work anyway? Any special instructions for these German pumpkins? Granddad always said that the man who gave him the seed said that there was a sacrifice that was required so that they reach their full potential. What that sacrifice was, the man wouldn't say. Granddad figured if anyone knew anything about sacrifices, it would be farmers like us. Reggie wasn't wrong. All farmers knew about sacrifice. Farming was a sacrifice in one way or another. You sacrificed your time, your love, your family, your hair, and damn near everything else so you could afford to keep the lights on and the taxes paid for another year. Sod busting was nothing but sacrifice in many ways, and Clarence figured he'd plant the seeds and see what came from them. He honestly figured he'd get more out of the other packets of seeds than these two old pumpkin bullets anyway. He would he would look back on that moment and reflect that he had known nothing of sacrifice. The seeds went into the ground in the east field, just like the generations of pumpkins had before them. As he stood up and rubbed the dirt off his pants, he looked across the field he had looked across the field he had nurtured and felt the same sense of pride he always did. Corn was coming in, potatoes and yams, beans, peanuts, fruit trees were filling in the orchard with a sweet scent, and now the pumpkins would be the crowning jewel of the farm. The July sun beat down on him, and he shaded his eyes as he surveyed his kingdom. Clarence knew it wouldn't be long before the harvest came. Soon the fields would be filled with the sounds of picking and packing, and it would be time to make another load down to Reggie's so that he could sell his wares. Clarence would lay enough back this year to make it through the winter, and maybe even a little more for the inevitable repairs to the barn or the house. Maybe even some expansion next year when the taxes came in. And, he reflected, once he won this year's grand prize for the biggest pumpkin, Clarence would open up his own stall the following year and sell his own wares, just like his father used to do. It was a great idea, and now it was time to see if it could bear fruit. A little too late for coffee, so I figured tea would probably be best. All right. The pumpkins grew slowly, as pumpkins do, but after a month, Clarence had three that he believed would be real contenders. He had named them, as he did every year, and the names he had chosen were no less grand than the pumpkins themselves. Hercules, Goliath, and Samson dwarfed their fellows by quite a bit, and it seemed that these would be his entries this year. Some people thought it was silly to name your pumpkins, but Clarence always named the ones that he thought he was going to enter in the fair. The other 40 or so would be sold to pie makers, pumpkin carvers, and all sorts of other folks, but these three would be weighed, judged, and then made into pies by Mrs. Clarence for the pie contest, to be held 2 days hence. He always laughed about it, but he always laughed about it, but Clarence always felt a little sorry to see her make those pumpkins into pies after he'd worked so hard raising them. On the other hand, the blood pumpkin had sprouted only a single offering. Clarence had named it Fritz and set it apart from the rest. So far, it had underperformed, and Clarence didn't think it would amount to much. Fritz wasn't even as big as most of his regular pumpkins, but he kept tending it and hoping that maybe Fritz was just a late bloomer. He'd been surprised when he'd gotten anything out of the old pumpkin seeds, and Clarence had held out hope that maybe Reggie's granddad was right, and that these pumpkins would be bigger than the regular ones. He pruned it and weeded it by hand, just as he did with the other three, and in the hopes that maybe it would grow bigger and he could sell it as an oddity at Reggie's stand. While his other pumpkins were orange, Those other pumpkins were orange. This one was a deeper orange, like a blood orange, but its leaves had a strange wilted look to them. Clarence was certain that it would make someone an extra creepy looking jack o' lantern when Halloween rolled around, but he really didn't have too high hopes for the stunted little thing, other than that. Then, one morning, after caring for it for more than 4 weeks, Clarence was in for a surprise, a painful surprise. Gotta keep the pipes watered. Clarence was out tending to the pumpkins, tracking their growth tracking their growth as he nurtured them. His top three were still larger and fuller than the others, and Goliath was quickly showing to be the front runner for this year's contest winner. He was pruning around Fritz, his mind wandering, when his shears caught the edge of his index finger. It wasn't a deep cut, but like any wound, it bled a little bit. Clarence sna- Clarence snatched his finger back and put it in his mouth as a few drops splattered on the earth around the pumpkin. He didn't think much of it at the time. It was just a cut, and he slid the bandana out of his pocket and held it to the wound. He waited for the bandage to stop. He waited for the bleeding to stop, and then he got back to work. He didn't think anything about it until the next day. When he went to check on the pumpkins, Clarence noticed something odd had happened. It wasn't substantial. The pumpkin hadn't grown giant overnight, but the blood pumpkin had grown. The day before, it had been no bigger than a craft store decoration, but now it bulged. It bulged from the ground like a blood red tumor. Overnight, it had become larger than Samson, the smallest of his entries to be by the smallest of his entries to the fair. Clarence scratched his head as he took in the anomaly, getting getting knee bound so he could take a better look at Fritz. He had done nothing different besides giving it a little blood, and then he remembered what Reggie had said. The plant required a sacrifice. The pumpkin needed something more than water and sunlight to thrive. Clarence suddenly wondered how big Fritz could get. Wasn't the notion of beating De- wasn't the notion of beating Decker worth a little blood? If you're just joining us, this is Blood Pumpkins, and we're still pretty new into it. So if you're just joining us, don't worry, you haven't missed anything. As though in a daze, Clarence pulled out his buck knife and slid the blade across the meat of his palm. The sting was little more than an afterthought, and as he squeezed his fingers together, he watched the scarlet stream fall on the soil near the pumpkin. The drops splashed across the vines as well, a single fat drop splattering the body of the gourd, and as it fell, Clarence could swear he heard it growing. It was a soft, whispery noise, like the trees in a high wind, and as the ground drank his blood, it left nothing behind. It grew before his eyes, looking bigger than it had a minute ago. Clarence wrapped the same bandana around his hand and put it back in his pocket. The pumpkin required a lot of TLC, but it would be worth it once he wiped the smile off of David Decker's face. When he returned the next day, Fritz had grown 3 inches overnight. For the next 2 weeks, Clarence made a splash of his own blood a regular part of the pumpkin's diet. It was never much, the amount you'd get from a diabetes test, but in 2 weeks, he noticed a change in size of the blood pumpkin. It grew as big as any of the other pumpkins Clarence had planted, overshadowing Goliath by a large amount. By the last week of August, Fritz was the clear entry to the fair. The sight of Fritz filled him with pride, but it also made his fingers itch. Anyone who cared to look would have seen the bruises on his fingertips and palm. Mrs. Clarence had certainly made a note of them, and had made a lot of them as she doctored them at the dining room table. But she was the only one so far. The farm had a lot of visitors in the last week of August, to his surprise. Someone, it seemed, had seen the blood pumpkins. Oh, hey, Jennifer. Thanks for joining us. Oh, hi, Bella. Thanks for joining us, too. It's good you guys could make it. We're reading Blood Pumpkins. Let's see, where were we? It was his neighbors at first. He could hardly miss a pumpkin that was nearly 5 feet tall and 4 feet wide. He wondered if he could come in to have a look, and Clarence had taken him to the field to see it properly. After that, he was visited every day by curious townspeople wanting to see this miraculous pumpkin. They never went unsupervised, of course. As he spent more and more time with the pumpkins, Clarence was becoming quite protective of them. He began to worry it was large as it was going that it was as large as it was going to get, topping out just shy of 5 feet, and he started increasing the amount of blood he gave. He was back to cutting his palm for the fat red drops he'd gotten before, but even that didn't seem to make it grow. The ground drank, but the whispers never happened. Clarence slept poorly, beginning to neglect his other crops, and Fritz the blood pumpkin became something of an obsession. On the 4th day of October, Clarence got the visit he had been expecting. Oh, welcome, Gamma. You lurk away, man. He called on him early, just a short series of knocks that drug him from the table where he'd been having his breakfast. He was dressed in overalls and a blue work shirt, boots with run-down heels after many years of use, and a round crowned hat that he probably meant to make him look like a cowboy, but it just made him look like some farmer in an old John Wayne movie. He hadn't taken the hat off and just stood grinning at him from the front porch as though they were old friends. "David," Clarence said, hiding his mistrust, "what brings you all this way out?" Decker grinned. "Well, I'd heard that I might have a spot of worry this year. Someone tells me you've got a real contender on your hands. Mind if I sneak a look?" Clarence stiffened, sure that he'd heard all kinds of things. Clarence was sure that he'd seen pictures and heard gossip, but in the end, Decker decided that he really wanted to look at this miraculous pumpkin. As sure as Decker was, Clarence was just as sure that he didn't want him to see the pumpkin. Maybe it was jealousy, maybe it was mean spiritedness, but he felt that it might be something else. Clarence was pretty sure that the pumpkin didn't want Decker to see it. "Sorry, David, but you'll have to wait to see my pumpkin. If you want to look, then you'll get it at the contest." Clarence swung the door closed then, the conversation at an end, just like the pleasantries, and he found the tip of one of those run-down boots blocking the door. "Come on," Decker said, "just a peek. Hell, you've let half the town see it. What's the harm of letting one more person have a gander?" "I said no, David," Clarence said, his voice a little harder than he strictly meant it to be. "You can see it in 3 weeks, when it gets a blue ribbon attached to it." Let's see. Yeah. He moved his foot then, allowing Clarence to close the door, but when he nodded his head and showed him a grin, Clarence knew it wasn't the genial smile he'd shown him before. "Suit yourself, then. I'm sure I'll see it in due time." He was right, of course, but the seeing would prove to be Decker's undoing. He got his look about 3 nights later. Clarence stiffened when he heard the sound of someone cursing softly. He was in bed, his wife snoring peacefully beside him. He'd been unable to sleep, his eyes making a map of the dark topography of the ceiling, when he heard the noise from the yard. It could have been the wind, but he knew it wasn't. Decker felt himself getting out of bed and walking down the hall as he made his way to the kitchen. He moved around the dark table and stood in the screen door as he gazed at the shadow cast field. It was late, midnight by the clock, and there should have been no way for Clarence to see anyone in the field at all. Standing in the dark kitchen, though, he became very sure that he could see someone walking into the field, carrying something with a long handle. If you guys are just joining us, we're reading Blood Pumpkins, a fall classic. Thanks for coming, guys. I'm always afraid when I do one of these, I'm just going to be reading to myself, so it's always nice to have some company. Clarence sleepwalked from the house, silent as a ghost, and through the October wind, though the October wind sent goosebumps up his bare legs, he hardly noticed. As he passed by the woodpile, his hands clambered out to grasp around the old splintery axe that sat buried in an ancient stump. As he approached, Clarence saw the person staring at the pumpkins, staring at Fritz, and in the moonlight it was easy to see them transfixed by the silhouette of that swollen gourd. They stood stock still, contemplating the thing for nearly a minute, and Clarence was less than 30 feet away when he when they raised the tool and swung it down into the pumpkin with a wet, meaty sound. Clarence screamed in anguish as he ran, then uh, then bare feet slapping the earth as he churned up the ground. The person must have heard him, because they turned mid-swing. In the moonlight, Clarence failed to register the round-crowned hat and the face full of white, snarling teeth. In his rage, it didn't matter who it was. They had hurt his pumpkin, and now he would end them. He buried the axe in their chest, blade biting into the wood of the hoe, which they had tried to use to block the swing. And as the wood splintered, he saw the blood splash across his undershirt. David Decker looked at him with stunned and unbelieving eyes, but those eyes didn't fill with fear until something wrapped around his ankle. His blood had fallen on the ground between them, and even now the earth was drinking it greedily. He turned drunkenly, axe still buried in his chest, and as he did, he fell to the earth as the blood began to bubble from his lips. The red fell on the face of the unholy gourd, and Clarence saw it grow and writhe before his eyes. The vines twined around Decker, long stalks wrapping about him like the coils of some monstrous snake, and all at once the earth began to the earth began to writhe and churn as its roots came up to join its writhing tendrils. In his terror, David struggled, his hands lashing out feebly with the broken hoe as he dug beneath the soil, as he was dragged beneath the soil. Clarence watched as he disappeared into the earth and seemed to come back to himself as his rival disappeared into the soil. Clarence fell to his knees, felt them unhinge all at once, and he was knee-bound on the soil. As the roots began to slide over him as well, his mind slipped away. As the shoulder as the shadow of the blood pumpkin fell across him, now 6 or 7 feet tall and 5 or 6 feet wide, he could hear it growing and groaning. It grew with a sound like thin trees in a high wind, and as Clarence blacked out, he never expected to have another thought on God's green earth besides that last. He thought that maybe he had finally made his sacrifice, and that the pumpkin would take him into the earth as its next meal. It might have been kinder if it had. Clarence awoke in the field with his wife standing over him. The pumpkin, that 7 foot tall behemoth of orange skin and green vines, towered over them both. His shirt was clean, the ground undisturbed, and all signs pointed to the night's events being just a dream. You guys are just joining us. We're reading Blood Pumpkins. We're probably about halfway through it now, but it's just getting good, so you hadn't missed nothing. Except for the broken hoe and the ugly little scar on the side of Fritz where the hoe had bitten into him. David Decker was never seen again. The sheriff found his truck not far from the farm, and he came by one afternoon to ask Clarence some questions. The old sheriff sat at the table as his wife sat down and set out lunch, tipping his cigarette into a saucer as Mrs. Clarence shot him dark looks. He had asked all the expected questions. Had he seen him? Had he been here? And did Clarence know anything about his disappearance? Clarence told him no. He told him that he had seen Decker yesterday, but that he had left and gone wherever it was that he had returned to. Clarence couldn't very well tell him that once his pumpkin had that one of his pumpkins had eaten Decker up, not and stay out of the nut house. The sheriff made some notes, but ultimately dumped his ash into the garbage can and took his leave. He said the visit had been a courtesy anyway, and that they wouldn't keep Clarence from his harvest. The harvest that year was tremendous. The blood pumpkin wasn't the only thing that had benefited from David's sacrifice, and the yield this year was so great that Clarence could have bought his own stand without the money from winning the contest. That hardly mattered to him, though. Nothing really mattered at this point. By that time, Clarence didn't care about anything but the pumpkin and keeping it happy. October 15th, 5 days before the contest, he began to notice a change, though still connected to the ground and still 7 feet tall. It was beginning to take on a definite sag. It had a waxy look, possessed an overripeness, and Clarence had serious doubts that it would make it to the time of the fair. His blood would no longer sustain it, and whatever it had gotten from David was now gone. It appeared another sacrifice was needed, but Clarence did not have the strength to catch its food for it. The pumpkin was his obsession, but he didn't have the resolve to feed his neighbors to it. He was sitting at the kitchen one morning, trying to figure out what to do, when Providence provided. He wasn't willing to lure the victims for his monstrous pumpkin, but he couldn't stand the idea that it would be lost so soon. To have come so far and stumbled at the finish line was unthinkable, but to give the ground the sacrifice it desired was equally barbaric. Clarence had no clue what to do, and even from here he could see the pumpkin waning. It had gotten so large that he could see it from almost any place that overlooked the backyard, and the sight of it was awe-inspiring. Had there ever been such a pumpkin as this? Had anyone ever grown a pumpkin so grand? And now he was just going to let it die, it seemed. He was weighing his options when the knock came at the door. Clarence shuffled numbly to the door, and to his surprise, he found Reggie standing on the front porch, wiping sweat from his brow and smiling hugely. Reggie, the only one left in town who hadn't come to see his pumpkin. Thought it was time that I came to have a look. They say in town that this pumpkin is something to see. Clarence nodded. Clarence nodded, a wad of cotton resting in his throat at the opportunity that had presented itself. His wife was visiting a sick friend. The usual crowds had dissipated for now, and this was the first day in the week he hadn't had to play tour guide. It was just Reggie and Clarence, and he wanted to see the pumpkin, the one he'd heard so much about around the stand. Reggie had walked from town, just a few blocks away. He had probably told no one where he was going. Clarence offered him a glass of tea as he walked through the kitchen, and then he took him to the east field so he could marvel at the pumpkin. As he gawped in disbelief, Clarence slipped his hand into his pocket. "This is wild. Granddad said they were big, but this is huge." Clarence wrapped his hand around the buck knife he'd used to feed it his own blood. Even if Decker hadn't disappeared, I'm pretty sure that not even he would be able to grow anything this big. Reggie had his back to him, and thus he didn't see the knife slide out. "What have you been feeding this thing? Granddad said they took a sacrifice, but you must have spent a lot of time out here." He he was so lost in his own ramblings that he didn't hear the metallic click as the knife came open. "Unless you've been making actual sacrifices out here in the East Field," he said jokingly. "What's the secret, buddy? Virgin blood, goat blood, a little bit of full moon?" He stopped talking when the knife slipped into the side of his neck, stopped talking, and started gurgling. The ground accepted him, and when Clarence's wife came home from her sick friend's house, the pumpkin was 12 feet tall. A week later, the judges came to Clarence's house to see Fritz the behemoth. Clarence won the contest, hands down. It wasn't even a contest. The judges couldn't find a pumpkin even half as large as his, and when Mrs. Clarence came for her yearly sacrifice for the pie contest, he gave her the other three instead. She seemed disappointed. Perhaps she had noticed the mania this pumpkin had become for her husband. But she took them anyway and won the pie contest that year with the tastiest pies the judges had ever seen. As she left the field, her arms laden with pumpkins, Clarence first heard the slithery voice of the serpent as it offered its apple. The voice was autumn wind and winter's promise, but he'd heard it before, hadn't he? It was the voice that it was the voice that tells the father that he can squeeze a few more crops before winter. The voice that tells the prideful that it won't be that cold tonight, so there's no need to bring the livestock in. It's the voice of creeping winter that hungers for its sacrifice. The voice told Clarence that if it gave the field his wife, the fame he got would be eternal. On that day, Clarence turned away from it. On that day, he was strong. We're reading Blood Pumpkins, guys, if you're just joining us. We're pretty far through, but there's still some good stuff to come. The sound of laughing children and swaying scarecrows filled the air as the plastic flags snapped in the breeze. The annual pumpkin patch was something that Clarence looked forward to with great anticipation, and this year he had a prize winning pumpkin to display alongside the others. He had always played second fiddle to David Decker and his patch, but this year Clarence was the star of the show. It appeared there was a new local celebrity in town, though Clarence suspected that it was the gargantuan that sat behind the little fence in the patch. Clarence had arrayed the smaller pumpkins for sale, and even Hercules sat amongst them since he'd been spared the pie. The people filed past the patch, looking in awe at Fritz the behemoth as they made their choices. Clarence was at the card table where he sat with the cash box, his wife playing the dutiful hostess out in the field. From his vantage point behind the table, Clarence saw the kid when he stepped a little too close to the massive pumpkin. He he wanted to say something to him, tell the kid to back up, but he hesitated as he watched him waddle closer. Look at the kid. He was a porker. He was a hefty kid from a family of hefty adults, and he had stopped to stare at the pumpkin as he held one of its smaller cousins in his pudgy hands. All at once, he shifted the pumpkin under his arm and stepped towards the monstrous gourd with his hand outstretched to touch it. Clarence started to say something, should have said something, should have stopped the kid before he got any closer. But as Clarence started to raise his voice to warn him, he heard the voice of the serpent again, asking him to stand aside, commanding him to stand aside. The mustached man cleared his throat at Clarence, and Clarence sat back down. He reached for the man's money, his eyes still straying to the boy as he laid one flat pink starfish hand against the blood red skin of the monster. He cast his eyes away, but even that didn't fully save him from witnessing the end. The boy went into the ground without a sound, and when his pumpkin shattered on the ground next to the gargantuan, no one seemed to notice. The police were called when the police were called when his absence was noted, and they searched the fields and the forest beyond for a week without finding anything. The boy's parents sat at the kitchen table, his mother crying into the square of silk that Clarence's wife poured tea and assured them that he'd turn up. She had kept right on assuring her of that until nearly 10 o'clock on that first night. Clarence was lucky his wife was such a dutiful hostess, because all he could do was sit, shell shocked, in a chair as she puttered about and made small talk. Everyone thought he was broken up about the kid, and in a way, they were right. After all, it's not every day you watch a kid get pulled into the soil while no one's looking. Clarence saw the flashing lights from outside of the tent as the fair. Hang on, I think that's another one. Thanks for hanging out and watching me stutter over this book, guys. I appreciate it. We're still reading Blood Pumpkins if you're just joining us. So. Clarence saw the flashing lights from the outside of the tent as the fair raged outside. They had given him his own circus tent to draw in a crowd, and Clarence had no lack of people wanting to see the pumpkin. It wasn't every day you got to see a 20-foot tall pumpkin, and he had been making the circuit for the better part of 4 months. People were always amazed that the pumpkin stayed so fresh, so alive. But Clarence knew the reason. The best fertilizer always seemed to walk right through the flap of the tent, didn't it? He won the contest the year after the kid had disappeared, too. People said that he had a knack for growing pumpkins, but really, it was the same one. When it got 18 feet tall and 12 feet wide, it started to attract tourists from the local hollers. Some of them never made it back to whatever it was they called home, but the wreckers never asked too many questions when they came to tow their cars. By that point, Clarence was numb to the sacrifices. The pumpkin the pumpkin ate, the pumpkin grew, and as the tourists began to pay to see it, Clarence found that he didn't have to be a farmer anymore. The pumpkin made his farm a natural stop for tourists on the road, and they never grumbled too much about a few dollars here to see it. That was how he had come to be on the road and in this tent. The man in the suit had offered him a startling amount of money if he'd go on the road with the gourd, and Clarence knew that he'd be a fool not to take him up on it. They loaded it up on a flatbed trailer, took it to county fair after county fair, so the whole state could see the world's biggest pumpkin. They did this for 5 years, and in those 5 years, Clarence remembered hearing about a suspected serial killer plaguing the state. They dubbed him the county fair kidnapper, and in 5 years, he'd abducted more than 20 kids and 5 adults from the state fair. The state police even questioned Clarence, though not as a suspect. They wanted to see if he'd seen anything amiss, and he always told them no. He hardly had a choice, after all. If he'd suddenly told them that his prize-winning pumpkin was eating people, eating people at an alarming rate, they'd have slapped him in the loony bin. Clarence knew he wasn't blameless in the whole affair, but the pumpkin was good for his family. The pumpkin was good for the town, after all. In truth, the massive pumpkin in Clarence's East Field was the only thing that kept the town from being just another cow flop in the Midwest somewhere. The pumpkin brought in the crowds, and the crowds stopped in at the cafe to have a bite. They stopped at the gas station for gas and road snacks. They stopped at the farmer's market to buy fresh produce. They spread their money up and down the streets from May till November, and the town always had a corn maze or a fair of some sort to draw them away from the pumpkin and back into the town proper. At one point, Clarence's face and a picture of the pumpkin were even on the town sign when you drove over the city limits. Come see the world's biggest pumpkin, it stated in bold black letters. And at one point, you could damn near see the thing from the city outskirts. In its heyday, it towered up nearly 30 feet high, and it was as wide as a farmhouse. By this point, Clarence was blind to its feedings for the most part. Hell, by this point, Clarence was complicit in the murders. He had killed two for Fritz already and was responsible for all the rest as far as he was concerned. He had turned aside, hadn't he? He was content to sit on a lawn chair by the fence and charge people for the opportunity to stand at the base of the giant and feel small in the shadow of a pumpkin. Unfortunately, Clarence had made the same mistake that many men in his position often made. He had lived in the shadow of the dragon for so long that he believed that he was safe, that his family was safe. It depended on him, after all, and he believed that he and his family were safe from the slithering grasp. Even after 5 years, he didn't really grasp its slyness, its cunning, until it finally took someone that he couldn't turn away from. Oh, welcome, Susan. Thanks for stopping by. Let's see. It happened suddenly, but the horror of it would never leave him, no matter how long he lived. He was standing in the back door, watching her work in the garden. He was trying to ignore the creeping voice as it told him that it needed to be fed. She was out in the field, tending some vegetables in the space that he no longer used, and as he watched her, he began to wonder if he might resist the evil and win free. Clarence had been this pumpkin's puppet for nearly 8 years, 8 long years of dragging its burden around his neck, and his heart was growing heavy with the burden of it. As he, excuse me, as he watched her in her purity and love, he began to think that he might escape this evil thing and be the man that he once was. They could leave, just pack their things up and go. They they could leave. They could leave this cursed earth behind them as they set out to start anew somewhere else. She had noticed something was off, likely noticed from the start that something was off, but she was dutiful. She was obedient, and she loved him more than he could ever love her. He would never have to let her he would never have let her go near the field again if he had. She was coming in carrying a basket of produce, and he would always remember the way she smiled when she saw him. Her face, her old young face, stretched into a smile, and she raised a hand to wave. Clarence had raised his hand too, had it half cocked for a wave of his own, but it dried on his wrist when she dropped into the earth. Dropped. Dropped was the right word. She didn't sink. She wasn't pulled. It was as though a hole opened up and swallowed her in one gulp. Her basket fell, tumbling vegetables across the dirt, and it was all the evidence that existed that she had ever been there at all. Oh, somebody wants attention. It's Clarence hitched in a breath as he stared at those rolling vegetables, his scream of rage and pain nearly ripping his throat apart as it rocketed into the world. It laughed at him as he dug up the field. Clarence dug it up in furious crumping sweeps of the shovel, but he never found a trace of her. He stayed out there digging until well past moonrise, with only Fritz for company. She was the last sacrifice he was part of. She was the last meat that Fritz didn't have to catch for himself. That was also the last time that Clarence tried to square up with the terrible giant. It was black dark when he went inside, but it was past midnight when he stood at the shadow of the pumpkin when he stood in the shadow of the pumpkin again. He was drunk, weaving and bleary, and in his hands was was a tin holder with a rag in the neck. Clarence had concocted this plan as he crawled headfirst into a jug of corn whiskey, and it was the best plan that he could think of. The coal oil would burn hot and bright, and when he threw it on the pumpkin, it caught immediately. He sat back and watched as the flames ate at the fuel, but the pumpkin did nothing but laugh at his futile efforts. The slithering voice told him that it couldn't kill it that easily. It told him that the two were stuck together now, and there wasn't a damn thing that he could do about it. It had been wrong on that last account, or so Clarence hoped. He set up a fence after that and never let the tourists get close again. They could pay their money and observe from a distance, but no one was allowed to go into the field again. It cawed at him as Clarence sat in the chair by the fence. It said it was a useless gesture, that it wouldn't stop it from having its due, but he ignored it. He kept his vigil, kept his silence, and as the two lived, the town shriveled around them. We are almost finished with Blood Pumpkins, guys. I appreciate you coming by to listen. It had gotten too powerful, too evil to be contained, and those who spent time close to it became susceptible to its voice. They came in the night, and they died silently in the field as they were drawn to the earth. The sheriff, the owner of the feed store, the girl who served the coffee at the diner, they all came to the field to give their lives to the gourd. Clarence tried to stop them, but no matter what he tried to do or how much he fought, they all came to the ground and gave their life's blood. The town sat deserted. The town sits deserted, a ghost town in a country full of ghost towns, and the only thing to see now is Fritz. Fritz, the world's oldest pumpkin. They're both shriveled now, a couple of relics from a bygone time, and those who come to see them usually say how they saw Big Fritz, when they were kids. Excuse me. Clarence still keeps his vigil, but the pumpkin is a lot more manageable now. He sits in a glass case small and red and angry. And those who stand around looking too long always come away with headaches. For $5, you can get your selfies and have a pamphlet on the ninth wonder of the world. But the crowds have mostly gone now. He's a shriveled old thing, small as one of the small as he was before Clarence dropped his blood on him. But if you spend too much time in his company, you can start to hear his creaky old voice. You can start to hear his influence in your head. Spend too much time around him, and one night he might just draw you into the field and begin the cycle again. That's a good idea, though I don't usually do rule stories as a rule. I mean, I don't know. I don't like rule stories, but I might think about that one. It would definitely be a nice little nod. Who knows? Maybe I'll have old Clarence pack his pumpkin up and come to Kashmir or something. Everything seems to come to Kashmir. Um, I might do one more. You guys got any preferences? If not, I'm just gonna grab one. Oh, that's a good one. Um, we'll do the Whistler. That's a that's an oldie but a goodie. Um, give me just a second. Let me set up a light here. My eyesight's bad enough without having to fight a light. Oh, that's too bright. There we go. Whew. Again, thanks you guys for coming out. I appreciate it. If you'd like to read some holiday tales of your own, go get your own copy of Fall Frights and Winter Chills on Amazon. Um, that's pretty cheap. I think everybody should have one. I might be a little biased though. That's true. The rule stories are really good for like starting your creepypasta journey there. A lot of people start with rule stories or Wendigo stories, it seems like. Skinwalkers, that kind of thing. That's where people seem to be. Nah, not too late. Oh, well, I was gonna say I used to have a way you could order it directly from me and I could send you a copy, but um I don't know how to do that anymore. I need to set up a website. I'm bad at that. Um if you want a book anytime I write one, you can always sign up on Patreon too. $10 a month. And I've got a book coming out at the end of this month, actually. It's going to be another Halloween one. I think there's like 20, 22, 25 stories in it. I can't remember. But it's gonna be a pretty good one. I should probably start making a cover for that. Jennifer would know, yeah. She's been a patron for a long, long time. I'll use skinwalkers every now and again, but for the most part, I like to make up my own monsters or like use lesser known creatures. Um, some of you guys that have been watching the Halloween content probably saw Stingy Jack and Rawhead and Bloody Bones, two kind of a little more like colloquial monsters that I did. That Bloody Bones and Rawhead are really just do not get enough love. Like that's a duo that really needs more stories. Um, I think they're Irish. I think both of them are Irish or Scottish in origin. But I mean, Bloody Bones literally just he strips the bones and meat from children. Like that's horrifying Halloween fodder all on its own. They were a lot of fun to write too. But I've got more planned for next year too. I kind of want to continue the haunted house series too. Rare and ancient creatures are cool too. I really want to dive into some of the more the Mexican creatures, the creatures from Mexico. They've got a lot of really good like legends and stories and things. I did I think it's Lalazuda, the Owl Witch lady a couple of years ago, and it was a lot of fun. Oh, thanks, Jennifer. I do try. I've been trying to really put on a spread for you guys for Halloween. You know, I know you can see it on other channels too, because I've Mr. Creepypasta and I like pass stories back and forth. So kind of like the Chupacabra. The Chupacabra is a little mainstream for me. There's uh, I've got to remember exactly what it is. I think his name is El Sabone, and he smells ladies' hair and then he stops them from getting married. And the legend of it is horrifying, and I'm like, I need to do a story about that. You are correct there. If you write too many stories about kids getting killed, it's like writing about pets getting killed. Which I think my cat kill counter is up to like 7 now. So, yay! I had a fan at one point that was keeping a tally for me, and I love cats. I hate killing them off in my stories, but you know sometimes. Okay, we'll start on the Whistler. Oh well, trigger warning then, because this one doesn't end well for kids. Clint turned his head suddenly as the rustle came from the woods. He had heard it a few times, but it was getting harder and harder to put it out of his mind. The moon hung high overhead, a ghostly full moon that seemed fitting for Halloween night, and despite the size, it provided very little light. Reggie and Terry seemed unable to hear it, but Clint was very aware of every sound. The closer the crunching came, the cheesy yellow glow of the flashlights did very little to penetrate the familiar depths of the forest. Clint was beginning to feel the hair rise on the back of his neck. Normally, Stokes Woods was a place of sanctuary for the boys, but tonight Clint felt as though he were being pursued through a children's story by the big bad wolf. This was the first time that he had ever truly been afraid of the woods, but Stokes Woods was a place of firsts for him and his friends. Well, it's a good story nonetheless. Like it's probably one of my better ones, at least one of my better Halloween ones. They had grown up in a pretty typical suburban neighborhood: white picket fences, ticky tacky suburban houses, endless concrete for them to ride their bikes. The only strangers they saw were the occasional drifters or travelers that wandered through town, and most of them kept right on moving. Clint's dad worked at the steel mill, and his mom was a homemaker. Clint wasn't inundated with the problems that he often saw the city kids deal with on TV. There were no gangs or bullies, at least none that bothered him, and his afternoons were usually filled with bike rides and trips to the arcade, Boy Scout meetings, and exploring Stokes Woods. The woods lay beyond lay beyond the last house in the cul-de-sac. It was a little more than a barren stretch full of scraggy pulp trees, but there were they were pretty big. They were pretty big, and once you got past the pulp woods, Clint could believe that kids could get lost out there. The trees got taller and closer together, and it always made Clint feel like a real explorer when he and his friends passed out of the scrublands and into the actual forest. Oh, hey, Tyler, you made it. Nice. I wish I could write one like Siren Head. God, the marketability alone there, that dude has taken off. Like now, Siren Head is in the creepypasta pantheon, and you get all the merch rights. Imagine the Jeff the Killer guy is probably cashing in. I think he's got 2 movies coming out next year. I imagine that Slender Man's making a reemergence too, from what I hear. There's supposed to be another movie. So I guess I guess the guy that wrote that's finally kind of, making bank too. If they ever found him, he was unknown there for a while. Let's see. They spent summer days exploring Stokes Woods, making maps and setting up camps that would be found again later to their great amusement. It was their first brush with death, finding birds or animal carcasses on the trail and poking them with sticks, getting grossed out as the bugs crawled out of them. The three never guessed that one day they too might share the fate of those animals. They were young and therefore immortal. Their deaths were as unexpected as the start of the school again in August, and would take them as much by surprise as the first bell did every year. The woods were the first place Clint ever swore, yelling "damn it" as he skinned his knee one day. The others had looked at him with awe and fear, but soon they were all saying it, and worse. Clint was in the woods the first time he saw a naked woman, the three of them perusing the glossy pages of Terry's dad's Playboy as they sat around a campfire one night. It was where he'd had his first camping trip, where he'd first spent the night without his parents, and also where they'd found the treehouse. I know, right? We delving right into the boy's adventure here. The treehouse was a relic of kids gone by. It was a big old tree that sat in a clearing. There was a fire pit dug in the shadows of the in its shadow with a dumbwaiter to pull things up, and a rope ladder to climb up through a trap door. It had been built in pieces. That much was obvious. There was a wall inside with the signatures of kids who had added to it, complete with dates when they had been completed. When the boys had come across it one afternoon, their 9-year-old eyes had grown wide with wonder. They they knew they had discovered something special. Over the next few weeks, they had replaced the rope ladders, cleaned out the fire pit, and replaced the dumbwaiter ropes. The boys painted it too, finding some paint at the junkyard and painting the faded treasure in a wash of purples and browns and golds. They added a bike rack, finding some slightly used wood at the junkyard, and signed their names and dates on the wall with the project done. The easy trip to the junkyard, the easy trip to and from the junkyard made Clint believe that the treehouse had been mostly constructed from things the kids had found there. They asked old man Macy, the caretaker, and he said that kids had been coming and going for years, taking stuff for a project in the woods. They'd never say what it was, but I always hoped they were putting it to good use. Nobody else wants this old junk, but it's good that the kids can use it and put it to a use somehow. He grinned when the boys told him about the treehouse and said it sounded like a lofty use for such humble junk. Clint and his friends had been playing and camping and using the treehouse for several years when Terry suggested the Halloween sleepover. It's on a Friday. We can camp out in the treehouse, eat candy, and tell scary stories all night. Clint thought it sounded like a great idea, and his parents agreed. Three kids alone in the woods might sound a little weird to some of you, but the town the, t- the town the boys lived in was very rural. Their town had a population of around 12,000, and crime was almost non existent. Besides the odd traveler that sometimes blew through, everyone knew their neighbors very well. Besides, the boys had camped in the woods for the last 2 years, and the Boy Scouts had taught them how to camp safely and not burn down the forest. What could go wrong? Clint turned his flashlight back to the woods as a dry branch audibly snapped. He was having a hard time believing that it was just curious deer or a raccoon hoping to snag some of their food as they stopped. As they walked, Clint could swear he heard something else following them. It was a soft whistling, like someone very far away who was occupying themselves by whistling nonsense. The tune made no sense, and yet it did. He felt like he had heard it somewhere before, but he couldn't place it. The whistling was much too far away, though. It could be it couldn't be the thing that he was it couldn't be the thing that was breaking sticks, could it? "Come on, Clint," Terry yelled, and Clint jumped when he realized how far behind he was. "We'll never get there at this rate." I know, right? What could go wrong? Just print it on their tombstones. Clint, tu- Clint turned and sprinted back towards the group, glad to see the woods standing sturdy and inviting before him. They would be at the treehouse soon. Clint and his friends had hit the street about 6, just as the other trick-or-treaters were getting started. By 8, as the lamps came to life and the little kids began to head inside, all three had pillowcases bulging with sweets. They had traded their costumes for warmer camping clothes, and after a good night kiss and a promise to be safe, Clint had set off into the woods. He'd met Terry and Reggie at the edge of Stokes Woods, and Reggie already had a small pile of wrappers in his pocket. The moon was sufficient to navigate through the pulp woods, and they hadn't even turned on their flashlights until they neared the deep woods. Terry and Reggie talked excitedly about the candy, wanting to tell ghost stories as they ate sweets and traded for their favorites. Clint had talked animatedly with them, but he had been distracted. He could swear that there was a noise off in the woods. It was probably a bird or a high-pitched wind, but as they moved towards the treehouse, it seemed to follow them. The other two were oblivious, but the sounds made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. It came closer and closer, but never quite reached the boys. It actually seemed to pass their group sometimes, and Clint heard it often behind them as he did before them. We're reading The Whistler, so if you guys are just joining us, it's just getting good. In the light of the full moon, though, it had taken on a ghostly appearance. Or no, when the treehouse rose up to greet them, Clint sighed in relief. In the light of the full moon, though, it had taken on a ghostly appearance of its own. The black windows seemed like staring eyes. The Spanish moss that hung from the limbs were like webs from a spider. Clint felt a little chill run through him at the sight of it, but it certainly beat the thought of finding out what made those ethereal whistles coming up fairly quickly. Clint had hoped the noise would cease to be an issue once they arrived, but as they loaded their bags on the dumbwaiter, he could swear that the whistling was still surrounding them. It came from all sides now, seeming to be in many places at once. And he rushed them a little as Terry and Reggie began to roughhouse. This netted Clint some grumpy looks, but he barely noticed. Clint wanted to be out of the woods and into the safety of the treehouse as soon as possible, and once they were safe inside, lanterns on, and candy spilled across the floor, he began to feel at ease. This was their sanctuary. Nothing bad could happen to them here. They were children who had yet to experience any loss or real trauma, and they were secure in the knowledge that their parents could still protect them from anything, no matter how bad it got. They were foolish, but children are supposed to be foolish, I suppose. Most children don't learn any different if they're lucky. Guys, I'm going to take a 2-minute recess. Probably less than that. I just want to go get a bottle of water. I'll be right back. Don't go anywhere. I'll be right back. See, not even that long. Oof. It is really surprising how many of you guys use these stories as bedtime stories. I'm like, I would not go to bed listening to these. Would definitely lead to some weird dreams. Hopefully with earbuds, and I wouldn't want to traumatize your children. Let's see. Where were we? Okay. Reggie was halfway through one of the full-size candy bars they'd got from the Hudsons when Terry suggested that they start the ghost stories. Clint agreed and told Terry to go right ahead if he wanted to tell it first. Terry loved scary stories, and he usually had a pretty good collection of them. He got them from the internet or wherever, and Reggie pulled a beanbag chair over from the corner, Clint dragging a camp chair over so the boys could group up around the lanterns. Typically, they would tell their stories around the fire pit, but they all sensed it was better to be inside tonight. Halloween was unique somehow. It was best to be inside after dark, lest the boogans and spirits that roamed around found you. Well, it's never too old, never too young to start them off on something creepy, but I also would like you to get some sleep later, I'm sure. Terry Terry brought the flashlight up under his chin, tilting the light knob down on the lantern and grinning at them ghoulishly. This is a true story. I swear on my life, he said theatrically before beginning the tale. He began a story about a kid plagued by the ghost of a hobo that he and his friends had accidentally killed. They'd been playing a trick on him, and he had choked to death on a sandwich. After he died, the kids kept seeing him around town, in a window, in a store, or on a street corner, even in his own bedroom, but his friends hadn't believed him. Then, while the boys were at a sleepover, the ghost had struck. Let's see. Clint listened, but found himself distracted as Terry unspooled the story. The wind blew outside the treehouse, creaking it in its branches, but beneath the winds, Clint heard a sound, a whistling sound, the same whistling that was coming from outside, a high pitched keen that was no longer altogether tuneless. As he listened to it, Clint thought it almost seemed to move through the surrounding trees as Terry wove his story. Terry came to the climax of his tale, and the boy's friends died badly. The boy escaped the sleepover and ran to his house. The ghostly hobo dogged his heels, screaming his name as he chased him through the quiet streets. But the boy had made it home and slammed the door in his rotting face. He had leaned against it, safe at last, but as he banged again, but as he, yeah, but as the banging had began, he remembered one crucial fact. His parents were gone, Terry said, grinning in the flashlight beam. He might have made it home, but he was still at the mercy of the ghostly apparition. It's about that here. It's pushing 10 o'clock. Ooh, still early for Oregon though. It's, Terry told them how the door had bowed inward, the ragged hands pushing the wood like wax paper. But Clint felt his attention dragged away again. He could still hear the whistling. It was closer now, and he could swear there was another noise too. Rustling leaves, maybe, or leaves crackling underfoot. Was someone outside the treehouse? And as Patches pushed at his door, trying to catch him, the boy snuck out the window and disappeared into the night, never to be seen again. Terry noticed that Clint wasn't really paying attention, and Clint turned as the boy made a disgusted sound. Oh, come on, that was a great story. Clint shrugged, trying to keep his eyes on Terry, but failing miserably. Yeah, I'm sorry. Something was distracting me outside. If you guys are just joining us, we're reading The Whistler, and we're about halfway through it, I guess. Hope you guys are liking it. It's one of my favorite Halloween stories I've wrote, which, I mean, that's a long list. Let's see. Reggie looked quizzically at me. What was it? Clint went to the window and looked out into the inky darkness. The moon cast everything in a hazy, otherworldly light, but Clint could see nothing but the vague outline of the forest and the fire pit. Let's see. Forest and the ghostly silhouette of the objects in the yard below. The whistling was still little more than an annoying afterthought, but it seemed like it was getting closer by the second. Clint wasn't sure what it was, but he knew he didn't want it anywhere near him or his friends. Clint, Earth to Clint, see any Martians down there? Terry joked. Thought I heard something outside, moving around in the leaves. Terry joined him at the window, and Reggie walked over to have a look out into the blackness below. The moon cast an odd light over their faces, but as he scanned the ground, it gave away nothing, no sudden surprises or anything. Both boys shrugged their shoulders and returned to the lantern when nothing emerged from the brush, but Clint was slower to come back. He heard rustling and came back to find Terry reaching into his bag for a candy bar. Clint made a half-hearted noise and walked back to the challenge for and walked back to challenge him for it. But Terry had already started pushing it into his mouth as he and Clint began to tussle playfully. When the two boys separated, Clint had almost put the whistling out of his mind. Terry began another story about a shadowy creature that lived in a stairwell, and Clint took his seat as he listened to Terry try to set the scene. As he laid out the narrative, though, Clint could hear the whistling again. It wormed into his consciousness, spinning through the trees outside like a drunken bird. Clint could hear the leaves crunching again, the wind making them rustle like skeletal wind chimes. And suddenly, Clint wanted to return to the window and look into the night. He was trying to listen to Terry's story, but the more he tried, the more Clint heard the noises from down below. When Clint interrupted his story to drag up the rope ladder, Terry definitely looked miffed. Clint latched the hatch and came back to find him with his arms crossed and an indignant look on his face. As he took his seat, Terry didn't begin his story again, and Clint felt a little self-conscious and asked what was up. Let's see, catch up on my super chats. What's up, Hi? Oh, you're not late. We're just getting to the good part. We're only about halfway through The Whistler, though this will probably be the last one for the night. I'm definitely getting sleepy. I probably shouldn't have read such long ones. I should have probably got a more bulk and smaller ones. But I think I got the best two out of the book there. It's Fall Frights and Autumn Chills if you've got your own copy and you want to read along. I know a couple of you guys do because you're patrons. So I've sent them to you. Let's see. Think you can do a better story? Terry asked, his hurt coming out in the question. Well then, Hotshot, have at it. He tossed the flashlight at Clint, and he caught it by reflex. He thought about it for a minute, starting to decline before realizing that he had a story. Maybe by getting it out, Clint thought Clint could alleviate the fear consuming him. Clint had come to realize that he was ruining his Halloween campout. And for what? Some noise outside the treehouse? It's probably just a raccoon or something that had been spooked by their arrival. His unease, however, had given him the perfect story. Okay, I think maybe I do have a story. Terry flicked his hand at him to go on, and Reggie sat forward a little in his chair. So there's three kids, and they're walking in the woods. They were going camping, and they were heading to a familiar spot in the woods to set up. They left their homes at dusk, wanting to camp out under the stars in just their sleeping bags. The parents told them that if anything went wrong, they could come home and sleep there. But the boys had done this 100 times, and they felt that they knew everything in the woods. They felt like nothing in the woods could surprise them anymore. But they were wrong. Terry sneered, but he sat a little closer and listened nonetheless. Reggie opened up another candy bar, the story drawing him in, as the stories almost always did. Reggie didn't seem to like scary things, but he was kind of a scaredy cat. He was kind of a scaredy cat, but he liked stories. He would sit and listen, getting more and more terrified, but always beg for another when that one was done. They walked towards they walked towards their determined campsite, talking animatedly about the s'mores they would make and the scary stories they would tell. Ooh, it's itchy tonight. One of them kept hearing something as they walked, though. He heard the snap of twigs and the crunch of leaves, and it made him wary. He told his friends, but they shrugged it off as nothing. It was late afternoon, and the sun was just setting, and the animals were probably coming out to hunt. They were probably just hearing the critters moving around in the dry leaves. The two of them went back to walking, talking between themselves, but the third kept listening, kept looking over his shoulder to see what lay behind. Clint had his friend's full attention. Terry was giving him Terry was giving his a little begrudgingly, but Reggie's eyes were large and starey as he listened. As Clint told the story, he almost thought that he could hear the leaves crackling outside. The wind in the trees rattled the dying year's foliage against the limbs, and the low whistling could again be heard outside. It was tuneless and wafting, and as it warbled across Clint's sanity, he knew that he knew just what was stalking these kids in the woods. As he spun his tail, Clint prayed he wasn't manifesting his own fears outside the treehouse somehow. I too hope everyone's having a good October and a fine Halloween. It's been a good one for me so far, though unfortunately I found out I have to work on Halloween, so that's kind of a bummer. But it is what it is, I guess. Darn being employed. Let's see, where were we? He kept asking them to listen, telling them it was important, but they wouldn't listen to him. They kept walking and talking, and all the while, the crunching of leaves and the rustling of limbs followed them, getting closer and closer. The boys became afraid. The steps sounded large, but he couldn't see anything in the trees as they hiked down the trail. One of the others finally yelled at him, telling him to stop being stupid and just enjoy the trip. There was nothing out there, but he could hear it. He wasn't being stupid. He needed to relax. He paused for dramatic effect, seeing Terry roll his eyes at the description of the boys in the story. That's when they heard the whistling. Clint didn't have to imagine that he could hear the whistling outside the treehouse. It was getting closer and closer as he told the story. Was the story drawing it in? Was Clint calling it to the treehouse? By now, though, he couldn't stop himself. The story needed to be told, and Clint became a conduit for it. He could feel it on he could he would tell it to the end, even if the whistler came right up to the tree after them. I mean, it's a jail on Halloween, so it's rarely ever good, but Halloween's probably the worst. Somebody said a couple of years ago we had a girl come in a full pyramid head costume and she couldn't get the head off, so she just had to sit in booking like that. They had pictures. They said it was pretty hilarious. She's in her jail jumpsuit, but she's got a giant pyramid head on. I wish I thought I could get a hold of them. I'd post some of them. I bet it was. It's something to see. Let's see. Where were we? They were all frozen when they heard the whistling. There was no wind through the boughs of the trees. This was a tuneless, monotonous whistling that cut across the dying afternoon like a sickle through wheat. It was behind them, seemingly on their tail, and as they heard it getting closer and closer, they began to make their way towards the campsite, walking a little faster, all three of them looking over their shoulders now. They were they were all made uneasy by the whistling, and they all wanted to put some distance between themselves and it. His friends sat forward, hanging on Clint's every word, entranced by this new development. Outside, Clint could hear the whistling coming from just outside the clearing. Hil- Hilarious to see, but like probably hard to keep inside. Like it was pretty big. Like I imagine it was probably like pretty difficult to house. They didn't talk anymore. They didn't laugh. They didn't joke. They let their feet take them ever onward, but the whistling followed them. The friends who had insisted it was nothing said that maybe they should speed up a little bit. The campsite couldn't be far. Once they were there, they could they could maybe take a side trail and get back to town, or maybe it would just leave and they could get back to their camping. The other two agreed, but all of them knew that the camp out was canceled. None of them would sleep here tonight, not willingly. They sped up, but the whistling followed them steadily. One of them said that they should stop and confront the whistler. They must be human. Who else who else would be out here whistling? The other two shot him down though. The whistling was discordant, jangling against their nerves, sounding like nothing they had ever heard before. Both agreed that they didn't want to find out who was making that whistling, and they just kept moving. Something bumped the bottom of the tree, but none of them seemed to notice. It wasn't a hard bump, it didn't shiver the whole tree. It felt more like an inquisitive tap, a gentle knock. It sounded like something trying to get their attention. Clint put it out of his mind. Maybe it was just the wind or something, he thought, and he kept telling the story. They kept moving deeper and deeper into the woods, all the time all the time being chased by the whistler. They broke into a run, the campsite still not coming into view, and still the whistling grew louder and louder. The whistling took on a life of its own, rising and falling in its chaotic tune, becoming less and less discernible. The children put their hands over their ears, the noise scraping against their minds like a rusty scalpel. Their hands couldn't block out the whistling, though. They heard it inside their heads as it battered their senses, and when the first one tripped, the other two didn't stop to help him. They didn't hear his scream, but they felt a change when the whistler got to him. A night bird called out from the forest, but by then the whistling was in Clint's head, and it only registered as something different. He told the story frantically, hoping it would stop the whistling in his head, fearing what might have been called. I saw it on Facebook. It looked pretty cool. They dropped their packs and ran. They sprinted flat out, knowing that the trail must be just up ahead. They could round the bend and there it would be. And they would round the bend and there it would be. It would be where it always was, and they could just cut back towards the town. It never occurred to them that the creature would just cut through the forest after them. The trail to town had a talismanic effect about it. If they could make it, then they could just walk in. They'd be safe. They ran, they wept, but the whistling followed them on and on. Their feet crunched against the leaves and pine needles, sounding like gunfire, but they hardly noticed over the eerie whistling in their heads. His two friends were leaning close now. the lantern making their faces look like jack-o'-lanterns, as their eyes begged for the climax. And still that whistling assaulted them, threatening to drive Clint mad. If they noticed, they gave no implication. Yeah, we had a lot of cloud cover too. It was a cloudy day for it. You could kind of see it through them, though. When the second boy fell, the first never even noticed. He ran and ran, trying to outdistance the whistling, trying to get it out of his head. And when his friend was found, the whistling again took on a different tone. The lone boy ran faster and faster, hoping to outdistance the crazed whistling, knowing that his fate would be the same as his friend's. Some say he runs to this very day. Some say the whistler got him in the end. No one knows for sure, though. Drink here. Thanks for joining me, guys. We're about 75% of the way through the Whistler, but the big climax is coming up, so you won't want to miss that. Oh boy. That was when the whistling stopped. It stopped so abruptly that Clint wondered if it had ever been there at all. For someone his age to question his mental stability was a strange feeling, but at that moment, Clint was just glad that it had passed him by. The other two shook off their rapture, looking as though they had been hypnotized, and Terry blew out a long breath. Well, damn, that was a good story. I can't top that, and suddenly I'm feeling kind of tired. Yeah, Reggie said dreamily. Me too. Think maybe we should go to bed. Clint would have argued with them most nights, but tonight he was as drained as the rest. They laid out their sleeping bags and burrowed down, dropping off quickly without the usual talk to precede it. I'd like to tell you that this is where the story ends. I wish I could, but that wouldn't be doing justice to the memory of those poor boys. I urge you to stop reading here. Let his image be let this image be your let this image be your last sight of them. These young men asleep in their bags, snoring happily, content with the knowledge that they're immortal and that their parents' love will insulate them from any harm. No? Still here? Very well, then. Don't say I didn't warn you. Clint awoke in the wee hours of the morning when a pillow smashed into the side of his head. It was not thrown playfully, and he came awake angrily. The throw was hard and angry and directed at his face. As his left ear stopped ringing, Clint became aware of the keening whistling that assaulted his ears. It had returned. It was louder than ever, and it chilled him to the bone. For God's sake, stop it, Terry yelled, staring daggers at Clint. Your story was good. We all said so, but trying to scare us with that stupid whistling isn't funny. Clint became aware that someone was crying and looked over to see Reggie in the corner. He was ugly crying, snot and tears mingling down his face, with his hands against his ears. The whistling was loud and discordant, just as Clint had described it in the story. It appeared that Clint wasn't the only one that could hear it now. Terry looked madder than he'd ever seen him, and Reggie was clearly terrified after the story that Clint had spun. It's not me, I swear, Clint said to Terry. But Terry didn't seem to believe him. He glared at Clint for a few seconds before realizing that he was right. Terry had woken him up. How could Clint be whistling? Terry moved to the window, and Clint joined him as they searched for the source of the whistling. Most nights these woods would have seemed nothing. Most nights they would have seen nothing in the inky darkness, but under the light of the full moon, the yard was shadowy but visible. As they scanned the yard, they could see little in the pallid light. The fire pit below, the log where they sat and toasted their marshmallows and wieners, the wood pile that had been tarped against the rain. Clint had almost decided to go back and check the other window when Terry gasped like a stepped-on cat and backed away. Terry looked again and finally saw what Clint was looking at. A man in a long cloak stepped out from the tree line, and Clint couldn't believe that he hadn't seen him before. He was dressed in a long gray coat and a tall cowboy hat, making him look almost 7 feet tall as it poked for the sky. The toes of the pointy boots poked from beneath the coat, and Clint thought that they looked battered and scuffed, even from here. The wind seemed loath to touch the man, but by the way he pulled the cloak around him, you would have thought he was freezing. Clint could see a pair of eyes reflected in the moonlight as he looked up at them, and he thought the man must be wearing glasses. Of him, you could see very little under the coat, but it made them very uneasy. Oof, yeah, thank goodness. That new strain of COVID sounds nasty. If you can avoid it, all the better. The whistling seemed to be coming from beneath the cloak, and when it stopped, he began to speak. Clint wished for the whistling again. His voice was raspy, pinched, croaksome, a dead man pleading, a dead man's pleading last words. I'm so cold, boys. Might I take shelter in your treehouse for the night? Clint shuddered, not knowing what to say. Somehow, Terry found his voice. Go away. Our mothers told us not to talk to strangers, and we don't know you. Please, boys, kind boys, didn't your mothers teach you hospitality? Let an old man come in out of the cold, he pleaded. No, Terry said, and moved away from the window as though the man might somehow leap in through it. The man didn't yell, he didn't plead. He just sat on the log beneath the tree and continued to whistle. The jagged chords wafted up into the house, and Clint saw Terry shudder. Terry picked up a boot and went to the window to throw it at the man. Terry sent it sailing, but hissed when it didn't connect. He threw several other things as the whistling assaulted them, but the old man never seemed to be where he was aiming. Terry cussed loudly, reaching for the lamp. Reggie wrapped his arm around it, begging him not to. It's the only light we have, Terry, please. He tore it out of Reggie's arms and growled as it came free. He chucked it at the old man, the heavy plastic thing not even getting close to the target. It broke on the ground, shattering and fizzling with an electric pop. The inside of the treehouse was darker for its passing. The boys now hunkered on their bellies. The whistling went on, though. The man never seemed to run out of breath, and the shrill noise took its toll on them. Reggie began to rock in the corner, sobbing loudly for his mother as the whistling went on and on. Terry screamed at him from the windows, his rage never ending, and Clint covered his ears to try to keep the threads of his sanity together. It seemed to last for hours, for days, and as Clint sat with his eyes closed, he prayed it would end. When he heard the floorboards creak, Clint opened his eyes. He saw Reggie standing by the window, his foot already on the ledge. Reggie, Clint breathed, what are you doing? Reggie looked back at him, snot runners creeping down his face. His naked face looked tortured, tears cutting lines down his dirty cheeks, still streaked with green. He smiled gruesomely at him as he framed himself in the window. Clint didn't have to ask what he intended to do. He tried to stop him. He pulled himself up from the floor to go get him, but it was already too late. I just want it to stop, he breathed, before he threw himself out the window. They never heard him hit the ground over the loud and terrible whistling. Terry stormed over to the hatch and unlatched it before Clint could throw himself across it. What are you doing? What do you think I'm doing? I'm going to go down there and do something about this guy. He's an adult, Terry. You can't do anything to him. Get out of my way. I'm going out there. He's scary, Terry. We should just stay up here. You'll end up like Reggie. Terry kicked him, sending waves of pain through his guts. Clint rolled off the trap door, clutching his wounded body as Terry threw it open. He tossed the ladder down, descending in a shrieking rage as he made for the Whistler. As scared as he scared as scared as Reggie had been, the Whistler had made Terry a furious juggernaut. Clint drew himself up, his ribs hurting, and hobbled to the trapdoor. He looked down He looked down before closing it and gasped in horror against his throbbing chest. The man was at the bottom of the ladder, his face still hooded by the coat, his eyes a glittering twosome amidst the swirling dark void. Clint could see thick red fluid around the collar of the coat. He was 2 rungs up the ladder, temporarily frozen by the boy's gaze, and Clint slammed the hatch and threw the lock a second before the Whistler slammed into it. He crawled away from the hatch, watching it buck wildly and hearing the Whistler scream at him to open it. He shouted blistering curses and howled like an animal, wanting to get in, but stopped by the strong bolt some past child had installed on the sturdy latch. Maybe they'd installed it to keep him out, Clint thought. Clint lay on the dusty floor of the treehouse, his ribs hurting as he watched the trapdoor throb like an infected heart. Just when Clint thought that he couldn't take any more, the banging stopped, and he was allowed to bask in the thin silence that occupied the next few seconds of his life. When the whistling started again, Clint began to shake like a summer leaf. The whistling had killed 2 already, Clint reflected. As he lay shuddering on the splintery boards, he wondered what the search party would find when they found their sleeping bags. Would he too be just another story for children to whisper about as they sat around the fire? As he lay there shivering under the assault of the invasive whistling, he almost thought about opening the trap door and joining his friends in the less penetrating silence that was likely to follow. That's the Whistler. All right, fellas. That was it's a good couple of stories. It's it's pushing 10:30 here though. I think I'm gonna turn in for the night. It's been a good live stream. I may do a few more of these before Halloween. I don't know. We'll see how it goes. We've got another weekend off before then, so we may check it out. I don't know. Anyway, thanks for joining me for tonight's live stream. I appreciate it. Hope you guys enjoyed yourself. Till next time, Dr. Plague signing off. Have a wonderful evening.